Before we start, don't forget to hit that like button. Our goal is to reach 500 likes on this video. Now, let's dive straight into the entire history of medieval Italy. Rome's collapse and the birth of medieval Italy. Picture Italy in the late 5th century. Rome had fallen, but its grandeur lingered in every stone and ruin. Into this landscape stepped the Ostrogoths, a northern people now claiming the heart of the old empire. Their leader, Theodoric the Great, became one of the most fascinating figures of this twilight age. A barbarian king ruling in Rome's shadow, trying to preserve its legacy while building something new. Theodoric wasn't just another warlord. Raised in Constantinople as a youth hostage, he had seen the Byzantine Empire's might. He admired Roman culture, and when he became ruler of Italy, he set out to blend Gothic strength with Roman order. Imagine a man straddling two worlds, a Gothic warrior at heart, yet wearing the cloak of a Roman emperor. That balance defined his reign. In 493, Theodoric defeated Odoacer, the Germanic general who had deposed the last Roman emperor. Instead of destroying Rome, he made Ravenna his capital and worked to keep Roman traditions alive. He restored aqueducts, preserved monuments, and kept the Senate functioning as a symbol of continuity. For many Italians, it must have felt like a strange half-return of Rome, only under Gothic guardianship. Yet this was no full restoration. The Ostrogoths kept their own laws and military traditions. They were Arians, a Christian branch the Catholic Church considered heretical. This divide simmered, creating tension between Gothic rulers and Roman subjects. The Church, growing in power since the empire's collapse, watched carefully. Even so, Theodoric's reign brought stability. Roads were maintained, trade flickered back to life, and cities began to breathe again. But stability under one man is fragile. When Theodoric died in 526, the balance fractured. His heirs lacked his vision, and new conflicts soon followed. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian saw his chance. Dreaming of restoring Rome, he launched his Italian wars. The Byzantines marched in, determined to take the peninsula. What followed was decades of brutal fighting sieges, starvation, devastation. Theodoric's dream of blending Gothic and Roman worlds crumbled in this clash. For ordinary Italians, survival meant constant adaptation. One day they served Odoacer, the next Theodoric, and soon enough they were caught between Goths and Byzantines. Imagine being a farmer outside Ravenna, trying to harvest grain while armies trampled past, each claiming to rule Italy. Flexibility mattered more than loyalty. The Ostrogoths left their mark not in monuments, but in the in-between world they created. They preserved much of Rome's framework, even as they reshaped it with their customs. They proved Rome's shadow was too strong to ignore. Every conqueror felt compelled to cloak themselves in its legacy. The twilight of Rome wasn't sudden darkness. It was a fading glow, where figures like Theodoric tried to keep the flame alive. In Ravenna, you might pass a Roman-style basilica built by a Gothic king, hear Latin in the streets, and still know the empire was gone. Out of that contradiction rose new powers, the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire. But for a brief moment, in the Ostrogothic kingdom, Italy stood between two worlds, no longer Rome, not yet medieval Italy, the Ostrogoths and the twilight of Rome's legacy. Picture this. Rome, the eternal city, once bursting with senators, emperors, and armies that shook the world, now quiet. Marble baths cracked, aqueducts dry, weeds creeping through the Forum. The Western Roman Empire had fallen in the year 476, and many feared civilization itself was ending. But then came the Ostrogoths, once seen as outsiders, even barbarians stepping into the ruins and trying, in their own way, to keep its spirit alive. The Ostrogoths were no strangers to Rome. They had brushed against its borders for centuries. When their leader, Theodoric the Great, marched into Italy in the late 5th century, it wasn't as a destroyer, but as someone who saw a chance to build on the bones of the old. Imagine being a Roman in Ravenna. Fear at first, yet what followed was more complex than conquest. Theodoric didn't dream of erasing Rome. He kept the Senate, preserved Roman laws, and styled himself as protector of traditions. His Goths lived under their customs, Romans under theirs. Two peoples shared one kingdom, side by side, but never blended. Some whispered it was only a shadow of empire, but it kept the memory alive. This was Rome's twilight, not Caesar's blinding daylight, not total darkness either. From Ravenna, Theodoric rebuilt aqueducts, restored theatres, and invested in architecture. For a generation, continuity seemed possible. Yet tension simmered. Romans followed the Nicene Creed. Goths were Arians. Seen as heretics, ordinary citizens may not have cared, but the divide remained. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the Byzantines watched with hungry eyes. To them, Italy was imperial soil. Justinian would later launch brutal wars to reclaim it, but that comes later. For now, Theodoric ruled over 30 years, bringing stability Italy hadn't known since Rome's collapse. But when he died in 526, his kingdom faltered. Infighting, Roman suspicion, and Byzantine pressure deepened the shadows. Still, the Ostrogoths left a bittersweet legacy. Protectors and outsiders, heirs and usurpers, they were the last to preserve Rome in the West before Byzantium's return. Not the end of Rome, but its final echo, fading in the distance. Picture Ravenna then. Gothic soldiers in cloaks, senators in togas, churches buzzing with debates, artisans piecing mosaics that outlasted kingdoms. Two worlds overlapped Rome's grandeur behind, the medieval age ahead. Uncertainty was everywhere. Lombards waited in the wings, the papacy was growing in power, Byzantium prepared its armies. The Ostrogoths' twilight soon gave way to storm, but for that brief chapter, they carried Rome's torch, flickering but not yet gone. History is rarely clean breaks. Rome didn't vanish in one night. It lingered, reshaped through new peoples and rulers. The Ostrogoths, though not Roman by blood, kept its idea alive just long enough for Italy's next act to begin. Byzantine ambitions and Justinian's Italian wars. Picture this. The Roman Empire is gone in the West, its legions scattered, and Italy carved up by new rulers living in Rome's shadow. Now, imagine an emperor in Constantinople staring west, convinced he can stitch the empire back together. That was Justinian, and his dream would ignite one of the most brutal wars medieval Italy ever saw. Justinian didn't want to be remembered as a caretaker. He wanted to be a new Augustus. You may know him for the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, that soaring dome that still stuns. But his greatest gamble wasn't stone, it was blood. In the 6th century, he launched wars to reclaim the lost western provinces, with Italy, the empire's old heart, as the ultimate prize. At the time, Italy was ruled by the Ostrogoths, heirs of Theodoric. By Justinian's day, that experiment was cracking. Internal divisions made them vulnerable. With his general Belisarius, Justinian struck. Belisarius feels larger than life, a man leading armies across seas and ruins. He'd already crushed the Vandals in North Africa. In 535, he landed in Sicily, which quickly fell. From there, he stormed into Italy. At first, it seemed easy. Rome itself opened its gates. But the war dragged on. The Goths regrouped, turning the conflict into sieges, starvation, and cities changing hands. Rome was besieged repeatedly, its people starving, its walls crumbling, yet still it endured. Then came Totila, a Gothic king who rallied his people and even recaptured Rome. Charismatic and shrewd, he tried to win hearts as well as battles, but war devours mercy. He and Belisarius clashed in a deadly struggle, with Italy itself as the stage. The human cost was staggering. Fields burned, harvests rotted, towns emptied. Imagine being a farmer in central Italy, one year paying taxes to Byzantines, the next to Goths. Armies stripped the land, plague swept through, and chroniclers say Italy's population never fully recovered. After nearly 20 years, the Byzantines triumphed. Another general, Narses, finished what Belisarius began, defeating Totila and crushing the last Gothic resistance at the Battle of Tagenae in 552. On paper, Justinian's dream came true. Rome's empire stretched again from Spain to the Near East, with Italy at its centre, but it was a hollow victory. Italy lay in ruins, wealth drained, cities scarred. The Byzantines held a ghost of what had been, and soon the Lombards would sweep in, exploiting the chaos. So when you think of Justinian's wars, don't picture only triumphal mosaics. Picture exhausted townsfolk, ruined fields. Rome fought over like a bone between dogs. It's a story of ambition colliding with reality, a dream of empire that flared bright but left ashes smouldering across Italy. And in those ashes, the next chapter of Italy's fractured story began. Lombard invasions and a fractured peninsula. Picture this. It's the year 568, and a tide of warriors on horseback thunders down through the Julian Alps into northern Italy. Their name? The Lombards. They weren't Roman, they weren't Byzantine, and they weren't even entirely new to the peninsula. Some had served as mercenaries before. But this time, they weren't coming to serve. They were coming to stay. Imagine being a farmer outside of Milan or Verona and suddenly seeing armed strangers speaking a foreign tongue, seizing land and setting up camp. For the people of Italy, it must have felt like the world was breaking apart all over again. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed more than a century earlier, and Italy had already seen the Ostrogoths sweep in, followed by Byzantine armies under Emperor Justinian, trying desperately to reclaim Rome's legacy. Remember when we talked about those wars earlier? They had left the land scarred, cities ruined, and countless lives lost. Into that exhausted, fractured landscape rode the Lombards, ready to carve out their own destiny. At first glance, the Lombards didn't look like empire builders. They were a Germanic people, tribal, often described by later writers as rough and even barbaric. Yet they had something Italy sorely lacked: unity of purpose. The Byzantines still clung to Ravenna, Naples, and a few strongholds in the south, but their grip was shaky. The Pope was just beginning to step into political shoes he hadn't fully worn yet. And ordinary Italians? They were left caught between power struggles far beyond their control. The Lombards quickly took control of much of the north, founding what would become known as the Kingdom of the Lombards, with Pavia as their capital. The story of their conquests is almost like watching puzzle pieces scatter across a table: northern Italy in one hand, Tuscany and Spoleto in another, Benevento in the far south. But they never managed to piece it into one neat picture. That's what made Italy so unique in the medieval era. It was always fractured, always divided, never fully under one banner. And the Lombards were both the cause and the symptom of that. Daily life under them must have been a strange mix of continuity and change. Roman law still lingered, but Lombard codes slowly took root. Churches continued to ring their bells, but bishops now had to negotiate with Lombard dukes for influence. Families that had once called themselves Roman citizens now found themselves subjects of foreign kings. Yet over generations, identities blurred. Italians and Lombards married, shared customs, and even languages began to blend. Before long, what had felt like an invasion started becoming the fabric of daily life. Of course, not everyone accepted Lombard dominance quietly. The Byzantines held on to Ravenna for nearly 2 centuries, and their constant presence was a thorn in Lombard sides. The Pope, too, grew uneasy with foreign rulers pressing closer and closer to Rome. This tension planted the seeds for one of Italy's most important future developments, the rise of the Papal States. But that's a story I'll get to later. The Lombards also had their own inner struggles. Power wasn't always centralized. Dukes often acted like mini-kings, ruling their territories with little regard for Pavia's authority. It's almost funny in hindsight. The very thing that allowed them to conquer a fierce independence also kept them from holding everything together. Italy became a patchwork quilt of loyalties, rivalries, and competing powers. That fragmentation would shape its destiny for centuries to come. Yet, despite the chaos, the Lombards left behind more than just political fractures. They introduced new legal traditions, many of which would influence medieval law across Europe. Their presence reshaped the aristocracy, blending Germanic warrior culture with Roman traditions. Even their very name survives in Lombardy, the wealthy region around Milan that still carries their legacy. By the time Charlemagne rode in centuries later to sweep the Lombards aside, their mark on Italy was undeniable. They hadn't unified the land, but they had ensured it would never again fall under the simple control of one empire. Their invasion was both the beginning of medieval Italy's long story of division and the spark that lit the struggles between emperors, popes, and city-states that came after. So next time you hear about Florence rising, Venice sailing to glory, or the fierce battles of Guelphs and Ghibellines, remember this. It all traces back, in some way, to that moment when the Lombards crossed the Alps and turned Italy into a fractured, restless land. Because sometimes, the most lasting legacy of an invasion isn't unity, it's division. The rise of the Papal States as spiritual and political power. Imagine a world where the most powerful figure in Italy didn't rule with armies of knights or vast treasuries of gold, but with words. Words spoken from the pulpit, words whispered in smoky chambers, words carried on letters, sealed with a fisherman's ring. In medieval Italy, this power of the word and the authority it carried shaped an empire unlike any other, the Papal States. It's almost hard to believe that the papacy began as a purely spiritual office, a shepherd to guide souls rather than armies. But after the collapse of Rome in the 5th century, Italy became a fractured land. Remember when we talked about the Lombards? Their invasions left the peninsula divided, vulnerable and uncertain. In this chaos, ordinary people looked to the Bishop of Rome not just for prayer but for protection. Imagine being a farmer outside the city walls, unsure if the next warband to appear would be friend or foe. Who could you trust, if not the Pope? By the time Gregory the Great stepped into the papal office at the end of the 6th century, the papacy was already acting less like a parish priest and more like a ruler. Gregory fed the hungry, negotiated with invaders, and even managed land. He didn't crown himself king, but he behaved like one when others failed to. It was the first hint of what was coming: the transformation of a spiritual office into a political powerhouse. Fast forward to the 8th century, and things really start moving. The Lombards were once again threatening Rome. The Byzantine Empire, which technically claimed authority over Italy, was far away and more interested in its own struggles. So Pope Stephen II looked north to a rising power across the Alps. He turned to the Franks, ruled by Pepin the Short, father of the more famous Charlemagne. In a dramatic moment, Stephen crossed the mountains to personally crown Pepin, blessing him as king. In return, Pepin granted land to the Pope, the donation of Pepin. This wasn't just a gift of fields and towns, it was the birth certificate of the Papal States. For the first time, the Pope was not just a spiritual leader, but also a territorial ruler. From this moment, the papacy's role in Italy shifted forever. The Papal States stretched across central Italy, giving the Pope direct control over a swath of land that acted as a buffer between the north and the south. And here's the fascinating part. Unlike other rulers who had to justify their authority with swords, the Pope could claim his power came from the Creator himself. That's a trump card no emperor or duke could match. But of course, earthly power is never simple. Over the centuries, popes found themselves constantly negotiating, scheming, and even fighting to protect their territories. Remember the investiture controversy we'll talk about later? That was a direct clash between popes and emperors over who held the ultimate authority in Italy. The Papal States were right at the heart of this struggle, sometimes swelling with influence, sometimes shrinking under pressure. At the same time, the Papal States became a stage for some of the most dramatic personalities in history. There were reformers like Pope Gregory VII, who challenged kings themselves, and worldly figures like Pope Alexander VI of the Borgia family, whose ambition and scandal would rock Italy. Some popes led processions of prayer. Others led armies in armor. Imagine that a pope on horseback, sword in hand, riding out to defend the very lands of St. Peter. The Papal States weren't just about politics, though. Their existence helped preserve Rome as the symbolic heart of Christendom. Pilgrims from across Europe streamed to the city, carrying news, ideas, and wealth. Cathedrals, monasteries, and schools flourished within papal lands, and the influence of Rome radiated outward, binding together the faith of millions with the authority of one man. This dual role, shepherd of souls and ruler of states, was both the papacy's greatest strength and its greatest burden. On one hand, it gave popes the independence to act without bowing to emperors or kings. On the other, it dragged them into the messy, bloody politics of medieval Italy. The Papal States stood as both a sanctuary of faith and a battlefield of power. And here's the irony. The Pope's role as a ruler sometimes weakened his role as a spiritual guide. Critics would say, How can a man be so obsessed with land and armies? Yet without that land, without that authority, the papacy might never have survived the turbulent centuries of medieval Italy at all. The story of the Papal States is really the story of balance between heaven and earth, prayer and politics, faith and force. And as we'll see later in the clashes with emperors, the rise of the Papal States didn't just shape Italy, it reshaped Europe's understanding of power itself. Charlemagne's conquest and the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. Picture Italy in the late 8th century. The Lombards had ruled much of the peninsula for generations, but their grip was slipping. To the north, across the Alps, a rising power was weighting the Franks under their formidable king, Charlemagne. His name alone carried weight. Tall, commanding, and ambitious, he was not content with ruling just a kingdom. He had visions of an empire, one that would claim the legacy of Rome itself. And Italy was the key. The Lombards had often clashed with the papacy, threatening Rome and the independence of the Pope. By this time, the Pope was not only a spiritual figure, but also a political leader, protecting the fragile Papal States that had emerged from Rome's collapse. When the Lombards pressed too hard, Pope Adrian I turned to Charlemagne for help. Imagine the scene, a desperate pope in Rome writing to a Frankish king far beyond the Alps, asking him to march south and defend the church. It was a gamble, but one that would reshape European history. Charlemagne answered the call. In the year 774, he crossed into Italy and besieged Pavia, the Lombard capital. After months of pressure, the city surrendered, and with it the Lombard kingdom fell. Charlemagne declared himself king of the Lombards. But unlike past conquerors, he didn't erase their laws and customs. Instead, he absorbed them, ruling as both a Frankish monarch and Lombard king. For Italy, this meant yet another shift in rulers, but also a sense of new stability under a power too strong to easily challenge. But Charlemagne's Italian campaign was only part of a larger vision. He was carving out an empire that stretched from modern-day France to Germany, from the Low Countries to northern Spain, and now deep into Italy, and at its heart was the partnership with the Church. The Pope and the King needed each other. The Pope needed protection from enemies, while Charlemagne needed legitimacy. A sacred seal to make his conquests more than just brute force. That seal came on Christmas Day of the year 800. In the grand setting of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. Imagine the weight of that moment, the title of emperor, once borne by Augustus and Constantine, was being revived, but now in the hands of a Frankish warrior. It was not the Roman Empire of old, yet the symbolism was clear. Charlemagne was claiming to be the heir to Rome's legacy, and his empire would be known as the Holy Roman Empire. For Italians, this was a turning point. The peninsula was now tied firmly to a Transalpine empire, where decisions in Aachen, Charlemagne's capital, could shape the fate of cities in Tuscany or Lombardy. Some welcomed the order he brought, while others saw it as the start of centuries of northern interference in Italian affairs. Either way, Italy was no longer just a fractured land of local rulers. It was a vital piece of a vast Christian empire. Of course, the empire was more a patchwork than a unified state. Local dukes and counts still wielded enormous power, and communication across mountains and seas was slow, yet the idea mattered. The Holy Roman Empire gave Europe a framework, a sense that Rome's spirit had been reborn, now wedded to Christianity and the authority of the Church. This idea would echo through every struggle between popes and emperors that followed, shaping medieval Italy in profound ways. Charlemagne himself rarely stayed long in Italy, but his presence lingered in the laws he enforced, the monasteries he supported, and the alliances he forged. His empire would fracture after his death, divided among his heirs, but the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor remained a prize. For centuries, German kings would cross into Italy to be crowned, claiming the same Roman heritage that Charlemagne once held. The conquest of the Lombards and the coronation of Charlemagne marked the birth of something larger than a single kingdom. It was the beginning of an empire that bound Italy to the wider story of medieval Europe. And though the Holy Roman Empire would face endless struggles with popes, with city-states, with rival dynasties, it all began with Charlemagne's march into Italy and that Christmas day in Rome, when the old empire's ghost was given new flesh. The Investiture controversy. Popes versus emperors in Italy. Imagine two men standing face to face, each convinced he holds the ultimate key to power. One wears the white robes of the Pope, the other the crown of the Emperor. Both claim authority not only over Italy but over the very soul of Europe. This was the heart of the Investiture controversy, a battle not of swords alone, but of symbols, rituals, and the right to decide who truly ruled, idols, church, or earthly kings. The roots of this struggle lay in something that might sound simple at first, the investiture of bishops. In plain words, it was the act of appointing and giving a church leader his authority. For centuries, emperors and kings had claimed the right to do this. After all, bishops weren't just spiritual leaders. They were also landowners, politicians, and power brokers. Controlling who became bishop meant controlling cities, wealth, and influence. But by the 11th century, the papacy began pushing back. Reformers in Rome argued that only the church, not secular rulers, could grant such holy authority. At the center of it all stood Pope Gregory VII, a fiery reformer with a will of iron. Across from him loomed Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, proud, ambitious, and utterly unwilling to bow to Rome's demands. When Gregory decreed that no lay ruler could invest bishops, Henry openly defied him. Letters flew back and forth, dripping with accusations. Then came the thunderbolt. The Pope excommunicated the emperor, cutting him off from the sacraments and declaring him unfit to rule. For a medieval ruler, excommunication wasn't just a religious slap on the wrist, it was political death. Lords and vassals who owed loyalty to Henry suddenly questioned whether they could still follow a man cast out of the church. His throne trembled beneath him. So, in the winter of the year 1077, Henry took a desperate step. He crossed the snowy Alps to the castle of Canossa, where Gregory was staying, and stood barefoot in the freezing cold, begging for forgiveness. For 3 days he waited in the snow before the Pope finally relented and lifted the excommunication. It's one of the most dramatic images of the Middle Ages, an emperor humbling himself before a pope. Yet the story didn't end there. Henry would later strike back, even marching on Rome itself and forcing Gregory into exile. The struggle seesawed back and forth, with new popes and new emperors picking up the fight. The central question never went away. Who had the final say in choosing bishops and, by extension, who truly commanded Christendom? Italy was at the heart of this storm. Cities were divided, some siding with the Pope, others with the Emperor. These tensions laid the groundwork for the bitter feuds that would later split towns into factions of Guelphs and Ghibellines rivalries that tore families apart and shaped politics for centuries. If you listen closely, you can almost hear echoes of this controversy in the chaos of later Italian communes battling one another. But the investiture controversy wasn't only about politics. It reshaped the very idea of authority in medieval Europe. For the first time, the papacy claimed a role not just as a spiritual guide, but as a power capable of humbling kings. This idea would ripple forward, influencing events like the Crusades, when popes could rally armies in the name of faith. On the other side, emperors and kings never forgot the humiliation of Canossa and kept pushing back, searching for ways to assert independence from Rome. Eventually, in the year 1122, the conflict found a kind of compromise with the Concordat of Worms. It declared that the Church would grant bishops their spiritual authority, while emperors could still bestow certain worldly powers. It wasn't perfect, but it ended decades of open war. Still, the memory of emperors kneeling in the snow, of popes wielding the weapon of excommunication, lingered in Europe's imagination. The investiture controversy left Italy forever changed. It highlighted the peninsula's role as the battleground of faith and empire, a place where sacred and secular collided again and again. Later struggles, the Norman conquests in the south, the rise of city-states, the battles of Guelphs and Ghibellines, all carried traces of this earlier conflict. The fight between popes and emperors was more than a clash of personalities. It was a turning point, a signal that the medieval world was no longer about simple power, but about who could claim the right to shape the very order of society. And in Italy, that struggle carved scars that would last for centuries. Norman adventurers seized Sicily and southern Italy. Imagine a band of restless knights, younger sons with no inheritance, drifting south from Normandy in search of fortune. They were not emperors or kings when they arrived in Italy, just adventurers, mercenaries for hire. And yet, within a few generations, these same Normans would seize Sicily and carve out a kingdom that would change the face of the Mediterranean. Their story begins in the 11th century, when southern Italy was a messy patchwork. Byzantines still held parts of Apulia and Calabria. Lombard princes clung to old duchies, and Arab rulers commanded Sicily with its glittering cities of Palermo and Messina. Add to that the papacy, the Holy Roman emperors, and a constant flow of mercenaries, and you had one of the most chaotic chessboards in Europe. Into this chaos rode the Normans. At first, they came as pilgrims heading to shrines like Monte Sant'Angelo. But warriors being warriors, many stayed to fight for pay. Their reputation grew quickly tough. Disciplined horsemen, as willing to serve a Lombard duke as a Byzantine general. They weren't loyal to anyone but themselves, and soon they began carving out their own footholds. One family stood above the rest, the Hautevils. The brothers William Ironarm, Drogo, and Humphrey set the stage. But it was Robert Guiscard who truly made the Norman name feared. His nickname, the Crafty, suited him perfectly. He played rivals against each other, bullied popes, and even outmaneuvered Byzantine emperors. By the mid-11th century, Robert had taken large parts of southern Italy, and his younger brother Roger turned his gaze to Sicily. Sicily was no ordinary prize. Under Arab rule since the 9th century, it had flourished as a centre of trade, scholarship, and agriculture. The island was rich in grain, sugar, and citrus, and its ports linked the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Christian Europe. But divisions among the island's Muslim rulers gave the Normans their chance. In 1061, Roger crossed the straits with a small force, beginning a campaign that would take 30 years. The battles were brutal, but what stands out is the Normans' patience. They didn't just storm Sicily in one blow. They chipped away, fortress by fortress, sometimes allying with one Muslim faction against another, sometimes leaning on support from Pisa or the papacy. Palermo, the jewel of the island, finally fell in 1072, and by 1091 the Normans had conquered the last Muslim stronghold. What emerged was one of the most remarkable kingdoms of medieval Europe. Instead of wiping away what they found, the Normans built upon it. They kept Muslim administrators, welcomed Greek-speaking Christians, and worked alongside Latin clergy. In their courts, you could hear Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Norman French spoken side by side. Imagine walking through Palermo, a city where churches stood beside mosques turned cathedrals, where markets sold goods from Cairo and Constantinople, where scholars translated texts across languages. This blending of cultures gave Norman Sicily a brilliance unmatched elsewhere. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo still stuns visitors today, with its golden mosaics and wooden ceilings carved in Islamic style. It's as if the Normans created a world where East and West met under one crown. And that crown soon rested on the head of Roger II, who in 1130 was crowned King of Sicily, uniting the Norman conquests into a powerful state. But remember, southern Italy had always been a crossroads, and success came with enemies. The Byzantines tried to reclaim what they lost. The papacy both blessed and cursed the Normans, depending on politics of the moment. The Holy Roman emperors eyed Sicily's wealth hungrily. Later, these pressures would pull the kingdom into wider struggles, like the clashes that defined the era of the Sicilian Vespers. Still, in their own time, the Norman adventurers had transformed from wandering knights into kings, who ruled one of the richest and most cosmopolitan realms in Europe. Their conquest of Sicily was not just about land and power. It created a meeting ground of civilizations that left an enduring mark on art, architecture, and culture. So, when we think of Normans, it's easy to picture them only in northern France or England after 1066. But their story in Italy is just as dramatic a tale of daring raids, slow sieges, and unlikely kings who turned a fractured peninsula and island into a kingdom that glittered at the heart of the Mediterranean. And as we move forward, the echoes of their rule will ripple through Italian history, especially when rebellion later erupts in the Sicilian Vespers. Venice emerges as a maritime powerhouse. Close your eyes and picture this. A cluster of wooden houses perched on stilts above a shallow lagoon, waves lapping at the edges, fishermen hauling in nets while traders unload small boats heavy with salt and grain. Hardly the scene you'd expect from the city that would one day become the queen of the seas. Yet this fragile beginning was Venice, in its infancy a refuge of people hiding from chaos on the mainland after Rome's collapse and the later invasions of Goths and Lombards. No one looking at those muddy islands could have imagined the empire they would grow into. But sometimes the harshest beginnings give birth to the greatest resilience. The Venetians were forced to live with water as both their shield and their enemy. They had no walls of stone to protect them, so they relied on the tides, the marshes, and the countless hidden channels of their lagoon. And here lies the secret of their rise. While the rest of Italy fractured under Lombards, Byzantines, and later Carolingians, Venice learned to survive by looking outward to the sea. At first, they were loyal subjects of Byzantium. The Eastern Roman Empire claimed authority over them, and for a time Venice acted like a faithful outpost. But gradually, the Venetians discovered something powerful. The sea was theirs to command. They mastered shipbuilding, crafted vessels that were faster and stronger than their rivals, and soon their oarsmen and captains were carrying not just goods, but influence. Salt, fish, spices, silks, the lifeblood of medieval trade flowed through their hands. What set Venice apart wasn't just trade, though it was politics. They invented a system of government that was as unusual as their city itself. Instead of kings or dukes, they had a doge, elected for life but carefully balanced by councils to prevent any single man from gaining absolute control. It was a system built on compromise, on checks and balances, and while it wasn't always peaceful, it gave Venice stability that many other Italian states could only dream of. Remember how the Lombard duchies tore themselves apart with rivalries? Venice found a way to keep its feuds contained, turning energy toward expansion instead of self-destruction. By the 11th century, Venice had already begun its climb as a maritime powerhouse. Its merchants reached into the eastern Mediterranean, forming vital links with Constantinople, Alexandria, and the markets of the Levant. They weren't just traders, they were brokers between East and West. When Europe craved silks, spices, and perfumes, it was Venetian ships that delivered them. And when the Crusades erupted, Venice stepped in not only to ferry crusaders across the sea, but also to seize new opportunities. The Fourth Crusade, infamous for the sack of Constantinople, was in large part a Venetian enterprise. The city didn't just profit from trade, it bent history itself to its advantage. Imagine being a sailor in Venice during those days. You would step onto the great arsenal, the city's vast shipyard, and see hundreds of workers hammering, sawing, and rigging ships with astonishing speed. The Venetians had turned shipbuilding into something like an assembly line, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Their fleet could be rebuilt, expanded, and launched with breathtaking efficiency. That's how they kept their rivals Pisa, Genoa, and Amalfi constantly on the defensive. Those battles for naval supremacy would rage for centuries. But Venice almost always managed to stay one step ahead. Of course, Venice wasn't invincible. Its success made it arrogant at times, and its wars with Genoa were bitter, costly struggles. But unlike Pisa or Amalfi, which eventually faded into history, Venice always adapted. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in the 15th century, cutting off old trade routes, it was a heavy blow, but the city found ways to adjust, even if the tides of fortune slowly began to shift. Still, in its golden age, Venice was dazzling. Imagine the Piazza San Marco filled with merchants from every corner of the known world, gold and spices glittering on stalls, the domes of St. Mark's Basilica shining with mosaics brought from Byzantium. It wasn't just a city, it was a statement that power could come not from fields or castles, but from the sea. Venice's story reminds us of something vital in the larger history of Italy. Where others saw weakness, Venetians saw opportunity. Out of mud, marsh, and water, they built a maritime empire that would endure for centuries, shaping not just Italy, but the entire Mediterranean world. And their rise would spark rivalries with Pisa, Genoa, and Amalfi rivalries that turned the seas into battlefields of ambition. But that's a tale we'll dive into next. Pisa, Genoa, and Amalfi battle for naval supremacy. Picture the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages like a vast, glittering chessboard. The pieces weren't kings and queens, but ships, sleek galleys cutting across the waves, carrying not just soldiers but spices, silks, and gold. And at the heart of this watery battlefield were three ambitious Italian rivals: Pisa, Genoa, and Amalfi. Each dreamed of controlling the seas, and each believed the horizon belonged to them. Let's start with Amalfi. Long before Pisa and Genoa made their names, Amalfi was already buzzing with trade. Nestled on Italy's southern coast, its harbour opened directly to the great highways of the Mediterranean. Amalfi's merchants were like magicians, bringing back treasures from the East, silks from Byzantium, spices from the Levant, even knowledge like the Arabic numbers that would eventually replace clunky Roman numerals. For a time, Amalfi seemed untouchable. Its ships darted across the sea, respected and feared, and its traders had connections stretching as far as Cairo. But Amalfi's dominance had an expiration date. By the 11th century, it was facing serious competition. Enter Pisa. Rising on the Tuscan coast, Pisa built its wealth on bold raids and aggressive trade. Pisan fleets struck deep into Muslim-held territories in North Africa and the Balearic Islands, capturing not only treasure but prestige. You can almost imagine the pride of the city as its sailors returned, sails heavy with plunder and markets overflowing with exotic goods. Pisa wasn't just trading, it was flexing its muscles. Then came Genoa. If Pisa was bold and Amalfi was established, Genoa was relentless. Its natural harbour, protected by steep hills, made it a fortress of commerce. Genoese merchants were shrewd, always looking for new deals, and their fleets soon rivaled Pisa's in power. The rivalry between Pisa and Genoa grew so intense, it became a defining feature of Italian politics. Imagine two neighbours constantly trying to outdo each other. One builds a taller tower, the other builds a stronger wall. Except here, the towers were fleets, and the walls were alliances with kingdoms and crusaders. Speaking of crusaders, the holy wars of the 11th and 12th centuries turned the Mediterranean into a goldmine for Italian cities. Pisa, Genoa, and Amalfi all rushed to take part. Ships carried not only knights and pilgrims, but also merchants who set up trading posts in newly conquered lands. Amalfi had the advantage of experience, but Pisa and Genoa were hungrier. They carved out enclaves in places like Antioch and Jerusalem, securing privileges that would fuel their rise for centuries. The rivalry wasn't always fought with swords. Sometimes it was about who could win the favour of the Pope, who could secure trading rights from Byzantium, or who could dominate the spice routes. Yet, when battles did erupt, they were fierce. The clash at Meloria in the year 1284 is legendary. Genoa and Pisa fought a massive naval battle that left thousands dead and Pisa's dreams shattered. From that day on, Pisa's power declined, its once proud fleets dwindling. Genoa had won a crushing victory, and Amalfi had already faded into near obscurity after being sacked by the Normans in the 11th century. Still, the story isn't just about winners and losers. Each city left a legacy. Amalfi, though small, gave Europe the Tabula Amalfitana, one of the earliest codes of maritime law that guided sailors for centuries. Pisa, even after losing supremacy, built monuments like its famous Leaning Tower with the wealth of its golden days. Genoa, the survivor, went on to dominate trade well into the Renaissance, producing explorers like Christopher Columbus, whose voyages would change the world. And here's the twist. These rivalries, brutal as they were, also fueled Italy's golden age. Competition forced innovation. Ship designs improved, banking systems evolved, and trade networks expanded. The Mediterranean wasn't just a battlefield, it was a marketplace of ideas and goods. Without this constant struggle for supremacy, the energy that later fueled the Renaissance might never have taken root. When you think about it, the battle for naval supremacy wasn't only about ships and harbours, it was about identity. Each city believed it was destined to rule the waves. And in fighting for that destiny, they wrote chapters of history that still echo today. The Amalfi coast still whispers of its trading glory. Pisa still leans proudly despite its fall, and Genoa still remembers the day it crushed its rival at sea. The Mediterranean was their arena, their lifeline, and their legacy. And while only one city could claim supremacy in the end, all three carved their names into the story of medieval Italy, proving that sometimes rivalry itself can be the greatest engine of progress. Florence's rise through banking, wool, and commerce. Close your eyes and imagine the streets of Florence in the 13th century. The air is thick with the smell of dye vats, where wool is being coloured crimson and deep blue. Merchants shout prices in crowded markets, coins clink in leather pouches, and in the workshops, looms clatter endlessly. Florence was not yet the artistic jewel we often think of, but it was already humming with energy. Its rise began not with Michelangelo's chisel or Dante's verses, but with wool, banking, and the restless ambition of its people. Wool was the heartbeat of Florence's early economy. The city became famous for taking raw wool, often imported from England or Spain, and turning it into fine cloth that nobles and merchants across Europe desired. This wasn't a simple process. Sheep farmers provided the fleece, dyers added vibrant colours, fullers cleaned and thickened the fabric, and merchants carried the finished product across the continent. Thousands of Florentines depended on this trade, and the city's guilds' powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants set strict standards to protect quality. When a piece of Florentine cloth reached Paris or Bruges, buyers knew it was worth the price. But wool alone didn't make Florence rich. Money did. As trade expanded, so did the need for banking. Florentine families like the Bardi and the Peruzzi began lending money not just to local merchants, but to kings and popes. Imagine the irony. Emperors who commanded armies sometimes had to borrow from Florentine bankers to fund their wars. With this system, Florence became a financial nerve center of Europe. Bills of exchange, an early form of checks, allowed merchants to move money without hauling heavy chests of coins across dangerous roads. This innovation made Florence indispensable to international trade. Of course, banking was risky. Some fortunes soared, while others collapsed spectacularly. The Peruzzi and Bardi families both lent heavily to King Edward III of England, who defaulted during the 100 Years' War. Their fall shook Florence, yet the city adapted. Other families stepped into the gap, most famously the Medici, whose name would later dominate not just finance but politics, art, and culture. But at this earlier stage, the system itself was the star. Florence had figured out how to turn trust, paper, and signatures into power that reached across continents. Commerce brought more than wealth. It brought people, ideas, and connections. The Arno River carried goods in and out, while Florentine merchants travelled as far as Constantinople and Cairo. They returned not only with spices and silks, but with stories, new techniques, and a broader sense of the world. This constant flow gave the city a cosmopolitan edge. Even before the Renaissance, Florence was already a crossroads where cultures mingled. The prosperity reshaped the city itself. Towers rose as wealthy families built fortified homes to show off their power and protect their fortunes. Churches expanded, funded by guilds that wanted their patron saints honored in style. The Guild of Wool Merchants, for example, financed the construction of Orsan Michele, a church that stood as both a spiritual center and a symbol of economic pride. Every stone and sculpture reflected the wealth being spun from cloth and coins. But Florence's success also sowed division. The gap between rich merchant families and ordinary workers grew wider. Strikes and revolts erupted, like the famous revolt of the Ciompi in 1378, when wool workers demanded better conditions and a voice in government. For a brief moment, the lower classes gained power, but the elite soon reasserted control. Still, these struggles revealed how deeply intertwined economics and politics were in Florence. Wealth was never just about money, it was about who ruled the city. Florence's rise through banking and commerce also tied it into broader Italian rivalries. Genoa and Venice might dominate the seas, but Florence competed fiercely through finance and overland trade. And within Italy itself, the city's prosperity drew it into conflicts between rival communes, a theme that would only intensify with the feuds of Guelphs and Ghibellines. Yet through all the struggles, one thing was clear. Florence had found its formula. Wool provided the base, banking multiplied the wealth, and commerce spread its influence across Europe. This combination didn't just make the city rich, it laid the foundation for the Renaissance, when the fortunes earned in banks and workshops would be poured into art, architecture, and learning. So the next time you think of Florence as the cradle of the Renaissance, remember the clatter of looms, the smell of dye, and the scribbled notes of bankers. The splendor of Florence's golden age was built first on wool and money, spun by merchants and financiers who turned a small Tuscan city into a powerhouse that shaped the course of Europe. Feuding communes, Guelphs versus Ghibellines, tear cities apart. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of a medieval Italian city. Merchants shout their prices, bells ring from high towers, and the smell of bread drifts out from the baker's shop. But then, a sound breaks through steel on steel, shouts of anger, men rushing down the street with banners unfurled. Suddenly, the city isn't just a marketplace, it's a battlefield. And the reason? 2 words: Guelphs and Ghibellines. On the surface, the feud began as a reflection of a larger power struggle. The Guelphs stood with the Pope, believing that Italy's freedom and stability depended on supporting Rome's spiritual authority. The Ghibellines, on the other hand, were loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor, convinced that only imperial strength could hold the peninsula together. But in practice, these labels were far more than political allegiances. They became family identities, city rivalries, and reasons for neighbors to hate each other. Florence is the most famous example. By the 13th century, the city was booming with bankers, merchants, and wool traders. But its prosperity was scarred by constant infighting. Entire neighborhoods were divided, one street a stronghold of Guelph supporters, the next of Ghibellines. Towers were built not just as symbols of wealth, but as fortresses to withstand attacks from rival families. A wedding, a business deal, even a casual insult could spark clashes that left bodies in the street. And Florence wasn't alone. Cities across northern and central Italy, Bologna, Siena, Pisa, and beyond all became caught up in this deadly game. In Siena, The Ghibellines scored a legendary victory against Florence at the Battle of Monteperti in the year 1260, when Florentine exiles opened the city's gates to the imperial army. Chronicles say the river ran red with Florentine blood that day, a memory that haunted the city for generations. Yet victory was never permanent. Power swung back and forth like a pendulum. When one side triumphed, it often meant exile for the losers. Families would be driven out, their homes torn down, their names cursed in the streets. Entire generations grew up with revenge etched into their hearts. This cycle of vendetta kept the cities in a constant state of tension. Out of this chaos, culture still found a way to bloom. Dante Alighieri, the great Florentine poet, lived through the bitter divide. He was a Guelph, but even within the Guelphs there were splits into white and black factions. When the blacks seized power, Dante was exiled and would never return to his beloved Florence. His masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, carries the sting of that personal exile and the bitterness of a city torn apart by factional hatred. If you step back and look at the bigger picture, you see how these feuds tied into the broader currents of medieval Italy. The Investiture controversy, with its battle of popes and emperors, set the stage for this city-level strife. What had once been a struggle between thrones now filtered down into everyday life, until even a baker or blacksmith might declare themselves a Guelph or Ghibelline. The irony is that both sides claimed they were defending order, but in reality they spread chaos. While Venice built its maritime empire and Florence grew rich from banking, these factions kept the communes fragile and divided. It was as if Italy could never stand as one because it was too busy fighting itself. This weakness would later make the peninsula a tempting prize for outside powers, from French kings to German emperors, each ready to step in whenever the cities turned on each other. And yet, there was something undeniably passionate in this era. People cared so fiercely about their city and their side that they were willing to risk everything for it. The towers, the coats of arms, the painted banners, all were symbols of loyalty in a world where politics and family honor were one and the same. In time, stronger dynasties like the Visconti in Milan and the Medici in Florence would begin to tame these divisions, bending city loyalties toward their own rule. But the scars of the Guelph-Ghibelline wars ran deep. They left behind ruined homes, broken alliances, and some of the most memorable stories of medieval Italy. So the next time you picture a beautiful Italian city square filled with sunlight and art, remember that not long before, those same stones were stained with the blood of neighbours, turned enemies all in the name of Guelph or Ghibelline. The Sicilian Vespers and rebellion against foreign rule. It was Easter Monday in the year 1282 in Palermo, when a spark lit a fire that would rage across Sicily. As church bells rang in the evening, crowds gathered, still in the mood of celebration. What happened next was sudden, brutal, and unforgettable. A confrontation between Sicilian townsfolk and soldiers of the ruling French crown turned into a massacre. Within hours, foreign garrisons were cut down in the streets, and within days the entire island rose in rebellion. History remembers this moment as the Sicilian Vespers. To understand why it happened, we need to step back a little. After the Normans had built their remarkable kingdom in Sicily, with its mixture of cultures and languages, their dynasty eventually faltered. By the 12th century, control passed into the hands of the Hohenstaufen emperors of Germany. Remember when we talked about the constant rivalry between popes and emperors? Sicily became one of the prizes in that struggle. When the Hohenstaufen line ended, the papacy handed the crown to Charles of Anjou, brother of the French king. Charles was powerful, ambitious, and ruthless. He dreamed not just of ruling Sicily, but of spreading his empire across the Mediterranean. But for the Sicilians, his rule was suffocating. Heavy taxes drained the island, French officials filled every office, and the proud, diverse culture fostered by the Normans and later rulers was trampled under French dominance. Resentment simmered like heat beneath the stones of Palermo's streets. On that Easter evening, it boiled over. Accounts tell us that a French soldier harassed a local woman, sparking outrage among bystanders. The violence spread like wildfire. Bells tolled, knives flashed, and suddenly the French garrisons found themselves hunted through alleyways and courtyards. Within a week, nearly every French soldier, official, and settler on the island had been killed or driven out. But rebellion always invites the question, who will take power now? The Sicilians knew they could not stand alone against Charles, who still commanded forces on the mainland. So they turned to Peter, the third of Aragon, who had a claim through his wife, a Hohenstaufen princess. The Aragonese fleet swept into Palermo's harbour, and the Sicilians hailed Peter as their king. Suddenly, what began as a local uprising became an international war. This was not just Sicily versus France. It became a clash involving the papacy, the crown of Aragon, and even the rival city-states of Italy. Remember how Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were constantly jockeying for naval dominance? Genoa sided with Aragon, while Venice leaned toward France, turning the Mediterranean into a vast battleground. For Charles of Anjou, the loss of Sicily was a humiliating blow. He still ruled Naples and southern Italy, and his dynasty would continue there for centuries. But the island itself was gone. The kingdom of Sicily split into two. The island, ruled by the Aragonese, and the mainland territories, ruled by the Angevins. Two kingdoms bearing the same name, but bitterly opposed a division that would shape southern Italy for generations. The human cost of the Vespers was staggering. Families torn apart, whole communities turned upside down, and trade networks disrupted. Yet at the same time, Sicilians felt a surge of pride. They had rid themselves of a hated overlord and chosen their own destiny, even if it meant exchanging one foreign ruler for another. The difference was that the Aragonese were seen not as conquerors imposed from outside, but as allies invited in. The echoes of the Vespers carried far beyond the island. It showed how fragile foreign rule could be when local resentment built to the breaking point. It also revealed how a single event, an insult, a spark in the wrong place at the wrong time, could topple kingdoms and redraw the map of the Mediterranean. And the legacy? To this day, the Sicilian Vespers is remembered as more than just a revolt. It became a symbol of resistance, a story Sicilians told themselves about standing up to oppression. Even centuries later, when new powers came and went, that memory lingered. The night when church bells called not to prayer, but to rebellion. From the Norman adventurers who had first seized the island to the uprising that broke Angevin control, Sicily's history was shaped by outsiders and by the islanders' constant struggle to define their own fate. And the Vespers, bloody and sudden, was one of the loudest declarations Sicily ever made that it would not be quietly ruled from afar. Milan's growth and the Visconti and Sforza dynasties. If Florence was the heart of banking and Venice ruled the seas, Then Milan was the iron fist of northern Italy. The city didn't grow out of salt marshes or fragile communes. Milan's power came from the land, from the wide plains of Lombardy that fed its people and fueled its armies. Picture a bustling medieval city surrounded by fertile fields, with merchants crowding its markets, craftsmen hammering out metal goods, and fortifications rising ever higher. It wasn't just a city, it was a fortress, and that fortress would one day be ruled by two families whose names still echo through history, the Visconti and the Sforza. Milan's rise wasn't smooth. Like many Italian communes, it was torn apart by the bitter feuds between Guelphs and Ghibellines, those endless clashes over loyalty to the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember when we talked about those factions earlier? In Milan, they fought with particular ferocity, burning houses, exiling rivals, and splitting the city into camps. But out of that chaos, the Visconti family emerged, determined to turn the turmoil into opportunity. By the early 14th century, Matteo Visconti had maneuvered himself into the role of Lord of Milan. What made the Visconti different was their ambition. They didn't just want to dominate Milan, they wanted to build a regional power that could rival any Italian state. Their rule was harsh, sometimes even tyrannical, but it was effective. Under the Visconti, Milan expanded aggressively, swallowing up neighboring cities and territories until much of Lombardy bent to their control. It was a new kind of power in Italy, not a fragile commune, but a centralized state held together by military force and dynastic authority. The Visconti also understood the importance of spectacle. They poured wealth into building projects that would leave their mark for centuries. The most famous was the Duomo di Milano, that vast, gleaming cathedral whose spires still dominate the skyline. Construction began under their rule, and while it would take centuries to finish, it symbolized Milan's ambitions to stand not just as a city, but as a beacon of strength and faith. Yet, like many dynasties, the Visconti line eventually faltered. Internal rivalries and lack of heirs opened the door to new power players, and that's when the Sforza family entered the stage. Unlike the Visconti, the Sforza weren't ancient nobles. They were Condottieri mercenary captains who made their fortunes through war. Remember how we talked about Condottieri shaping Italian conflicts? Francesco Sforza was one of the most brilliant of them all. He married into the Visconti family, and, when the last Visconti duke died without a male heir, Francesco seized the moment. In 1450, he became Duke of Milan, founding the Sforza dynasty. The Sforza carried on the Visconti legacy of expansion and ambition, but they added something new, a flair for Renaissance culture. Under Francesco, and later his son Ludovico, Milan became not just a military powerhouse, but also a centre of art and learning. The Sforza court drew in talents from across Italy, none more famous than Leonardo da Vinci. Imagine walking through the city and seeing Leonardo sketching designs for machines of war one day, then painting The Last Supper the next. It was under the Sforza that Milan became a jewel of the Renaissance. But ambition always came with risks. Milan's wealth and position made it a tempting prize for foreign powers. The Sforza had to navigate alliances with France, the Holy Roman Empire, and even rival Italian states like Venice and Florence. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they didn't. Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, famously invited the French into Italy to strengthen his own position, but that decision would open the floodgates to decades of foreign invasions. Despite the turmoil, The legacy of both the Visconti and the Sforza is clear. They transformed Milan from a brawling commune into one of the most formidable powers in Italy. They built monuments, patronized artists, and turned their city into a stage where politics, war, and culture collided. Even after their dynasties faded, the institutions they built and the cultural treasures they left behind kept Milan at the forefront of Italian history. So while Florence dazzled with art and Venice ruled the seas, Milan stood as a reminder that raw power, whether wielded by a noble family like the Visconti or a mercenary-turned-duke like Sforza, could shape destiny just as much as commerce or culture. And in the tangled web of Italian city-states, Milan's story was one of iron, ambition, and an unshakable will to dominate. The Black Death, and its devastating impact on Italian cities. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Florence in the middle of the 14th century. Market stalls overflow with spices, silks, and wool. Bells from church towers echo over the rooftops. Merchants argue loudly, children chase each other through narrow alleys, and the smell of fresh bread drifts from bakeries. Life feels unstoppable, vibrant, full of promise. And then, almost overnight, it changes. The laughter fades. The bells toll for funerals instead of weddings. Doors are bolted shut. Entire streets fall silent. This is how the Black Death arrived in Italy. The year was 1347. Ships came into the harbours of Sicily, Genoa, and Venice, carrying not just goods but a hidden passenger, the plague. Rats and their fleas, stowaways in cargo holds, spread the disease with terrifying speed. Within months, Italian cities that had once thrived on trade and movement became ground zero for one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The disease struck with horrifying force. People would wake up with a fever, black swellings the size of eggs forming under their arms or in their groins. Within days, sometimes even hours, death followed. Doctors were helpless, priests were overwhelmed, and fear spread faster than the plague itself. In some places, families abandoned their own sick, terrified of catching the disease. Chroniclers wrote that brothers deserted brothers, children fled from their parents, and entire households perished with no one left to bury them. Florence, one of the jewels of Italy, was devastated. Out of a population of roughly 100,000, more than half are believed to have died. Imagine walking through the city square, where once bankers and wool merchants shouted deals, now filled with the sound of funeral carts rumbling past. Venice, with its dense alleys and constant trade, suffered the same fate. So did Pisa, Genoa, and countless smaller towns. The very networks of trade and travel that had made Italy rich now carried death from port to port. The impact went far beyond the immediate loss of life. Entire industries collapsed. Fields were left untilled because there were no peasants to work them. Workshops stood empty, their masters and apprentices gone. Prices for labour skyrocketed, while the demand for goods plunged. The social order itself began to shift. Peasants who survived found they could demand better wages, or even leave their lords' estates altogether, breaking centuries of feudal traditions. The plague was rewriting society as much as it was destroying it. Religion, too, was shaken. Many people turned desperately to the church, believing the plague was Creator's punishment. Processions of flagellants whipped themselves through the streets, hoping their suffering might appease divine anger. Others, however, grew cynical, seeing priests flee their duties or die just as quickly as the common folk. Faith was tested, and with it, the Church's authority faced cracks that would deepen in later centuries. Culturally, the Black Death left scars but also planted strange seeds. Art became obsessed with death and decay. Murals showed dancing skeletons, grim reminders that no one king, knight, or peasant was safe from mortality. Literature took a new tone as well. Giovanni Boccaccio, living in Florence during the outbreak, wrote the Decameron, a collection of tales told by young people who had fled the city to escape the plague. His stories captured both the horror of the moment and the desperate human urge to laugh, love, and live even in the shadow of death. And yet, in a grim twist, the Black Death also helped set the stage for change. With so many gone, survivors inherited wealth, land, and opportunities. Cities rebuilt, but differently. Labor shortages forced innovation in banking, trade, and technology. The shock of the plague shifted the way Italians thought about life itself, encouraging new ideas that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. Remember Florence's rise as a hub of art and humanism. That energy, in part, came from a society forced to question everything in the wake of devastation. Still, none of that should overshadow the pain of those years. Imagine standing at the gates of Siena, a city that once rivaled Florence in power, only to see construction on its great cathedral halted forever because so many workers died. Imagine the silence of Venice's canals, where gondolas carried bodies instead of lovers. The Black Death didn't just kill it, reshaped the soul of Italy. What makes the story so haunting is how suddenly it struck, and how completely it altered the world. One year, Italian cities were thriving hubs of trade and culture. The next, they were hollowed out by loss. And yet, from that ruin, new beginnings emerged. The Black Death was a tragedy beyond measure, but it also became a turning point, forever changing the course of Italian history. The Renaissance dawns in Florence. Art, wealth, and humanism. Imagine walking through Florence in the early 15th century. The city is alive with sounds, chisels striking marble, bells ringing from churches, poets reciting verses in public squares, and merchants haggling over bolts of cloth. But beneath this bustle, something deeper is stirring. A new way of seeing the world is being born. This is the dawn of the Renaissance, and Florence is its beating heart. The Renaissance didn't arrive with a sudden flash of lightning. It grew slowly, rooted in the wealth that Florence had built from banking, wool, and commerce. Families like the Medici had fortunes vast enough to shape not only politics but culture. Instead of spending all their wealth on wars or fortresses, they poured it into art, libraries, and architecture. Imagine living in a city where bankers competed not just for money, but for who could sponsor the most breathtaking chapel or commission the most skilled painter. This rivalry turned Florence into a living gallery. One of the most striking things about this new age was its focus on humanism, a belief that humanity itself was worthy of study, celebration, and improvement. Medieval thought had often looked upward, toward heaven and the divine. Humanism shifted the gaze back to people, to their potential, their creativity, and their place in history. Ancient Greek and Roman texts, once nearly forgotten, were rediscovered and copied. Scholars like Petrarch and Salutati treated classical authors as old friends whispering across centuries, reminding Florence that Rome's legacy was not dead, only waiting to be reborn. This rediscovery of the classics blended perfectly with Florence's ambition. Architects studied ancient ruins to design new buildings with balance and harmony. Artists experimented with perspective, learning how to paint depth so that flat walls seemed to open into whole new worlds. Brunelleschi, with his daring dome over the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, showed that mathematics and engineering could achieve the miraculous. Standing beneath that dome, a Florentine could look up and feel both the grandeur of the Creator and the brilliance of human ingenuity. Art flourished as never before. Masaccio's frescoes breathed realism into biblical stories. Donatello's sculptures gave bronze and marble a startling humanity. And then, of course, came giants like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, whose genius turned Florence into a cradle of masterpieces. Their work was more than decoration. It was a statement that the human form, the human mind, and the human spirit were divine in their own right. But the Renaissance wasn't only about art. It was also about knowledge. Libraries expanded, filled with translations of Greek philosophy and new works in Latin and Italian. Universities grew in importance, and scientific curiosity was encouraged, even if it sometimes clashed with church authorities. Doctors studied anatomy, astronomers mapped the heavens, and mathematicians played with ideas that would one day shape modern science. Florence became a place where asking questions was not a danger, but a duty. We can't forget politics either. The Medici family, rising from bankers to rulers, used their wealth to secure power while surrounding themselves with poets, scholars, and artists. Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent, was more than just a political leader. He was a patron whose support allowed genius to flourish. His court was a gathering place where ideas flowed as freely as wine, and where a young Michelangelo first found encouragement. Yet this golden dawn was not without shadows. Florence was still a city of tensions, rich against poor, Guelph against Ghibelline, republic against princely rule. Even in the midst of brilliance, turmoil simmered. Preachers like Savonarola would later rail against the vanity of art and wealth, sparking bonfires of paintings and books. The Renaissance was dazzling, but it was never simple. Still, its legacy is undeniable. The Florentines of this era believed they were living at the start of a new age, and they were right. Their embrace of art, wealth, and humanism transformed not just their city, but all of Europe. What began with merchants and bankers, funding chapels and sculptures, grew into a movement that reshaped how people thought about themselves, their world, and their future. When we speak of the Renaissance, we think of Florence first because here the spark was struck. A spark born of prosperity, fanned by human curiosity, and carried forward by art that still speaks to us centuries later. Walking through Florence today, you can still feel it, the sense that here, once upon a time, the world was reborn. Condottieri. Mercenary captains shaping Italian wars. Imagine standing on a battlefield in 14th century Italy. Dust rises, banners flap, and the clash of armor echoes across the plain. But here's the twist. Many of the men fighting don't actually care about the cause. They're not loyal to pope, emperor, or city. They're loyal only to the contract and the man who leads them. These were the Condottieri, the mercenary captains who sold war as if it were a business, shaping the fate of Italy one contract at a time. The word condottiere comes from condotta, meaning contract. That's exactly what their power rested on. City-states like Florence, Milan, or Venice didn't rely on citizen armies. Instead, they hired professionals who promised to fight for pay. These captains often came with their own bands of seasoned troops, hardened veterans who knew how to fight, and, just as importantly, how to survive. For wealthy communes or ambitious lords, it was easier and often safer to pay for soldiers than to ask their own citizens to risk their lives. But mercenaries have their own logic. A condottier's loyalty lasted only as long as the gold kept flowing. If a rival city offered better pay, some wouldn't hesitate to switch sides. Battles could become strange dances, with both armies more concerned about conserving manpower than spilling blood. Chroniclers sometimes joked that Italian wars looked more like tournaments than slaughter, though when things turned serious, the brutality could be staggering. One of the earliest and most famous figures was Sir John Hawkwood, an English soldier who came to Italy after the 100 Years' War. Known in Italian as Giovanni Acuto, Hawkwood became a legend in the service of Florence. His tactics were sharp, his men disciplined, and his reputation so fierce that sometimes a city would surrender at the mere rumour of his approach. For Florence, hiring Hawkwood was like owning a human thunderstorm, dangerous but effective. Then there was Francesco Sforza, perhaps the most brilliant condottiere of them all. He began as a mercenary captain, shifting between employers, building his reputation, and marrying into the powerful Visconti family of Milan. By sheer cunning and military skill, he transformed himself from sword for hire into Duke of Milan. His rise shows just how blurred the line could be between mercenary and ruler. What began as a contract could end in a dynasty. The presence of condottieri also reshaped Italian politics. City-states no longer needed to rely on citizen militias, but that meant their freedom was tied to the ambitions of hired swords. Some condottieri even turned against their employers, carving out little states of their own. The fear of betrayal was constant. A leader could wake up one morning and realize that the very men defending the city gates had decided to sell them to an enemy instead. And yet, without condottieri, much of Italy's story in the later Middle Ages makes little sense. Their wars determined the balance of power between Florence, Venice, Milan, and the Papal States. They set the stage for the fragile peace that eventually allowed the Renaissance to flourish. Even in art, their shadow lingered. Hawkwood was painted on the walls of Florence's cathedral, honoured like a hero despite being a foreigner who fought only for pay. It's fascinating to see how the culture of mercenaries connected to earlier and later chapters of Italian history. The endless faction fights of the Guelphs and Ghibellines had shown how destructive civic warfare could be. Condottieri offered a solution: professionalize the violence, outsource it. But this cure carried its own poison, making cities dependent on men who valued contracts over loyalty. And when dynasties like the Sforza or the Medici rose, they learned quickly to master, control, or outspend these captains in order to secure their rule. By the time the 15th century reached its height, the condottieri had become both admired and despised. They were symbols of courage and cunning, yet also of greed and treachery. Some Italian writers mocked them as men who preferred clever maneuvering to real fighting, as if they treated war like a chessboard. Still, their influence was undeniable. In the end, the condottieri turned war into a business, one that shaped the map of medieval Italy as much as any emperor or pope. They remind us that power in this age wasn't only about crowns or churches. Sometimes it was decided by a pen signing a contract and the mercenary captain who promised, for a price, to fight your battles for you. The Medici family and their cultural empire. Close your eyes and picture Florence in the 15th century. Narrow streets alive, with the smell of fresh bread and wool being dyed, merchants shouting prices in the marketplace, and above it all, the bells of the Duomo ringing. This was no ordinary city. Florence was humming with energy, wealth, and ambition. And at the heart of it all stood a family whose name still echoes today, the Medici. The Medici didn't start as kings or emperors. They were bankers. But in a city where money was power, that was enough to shape the course of history. Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici laid the foundation in the early 15th century, building a banking empire that stretched across Europe. Imagine money flowing from London, Bruges, and Rome, all funneling back to Florence. The Medici knew how to use that wealth not just to grow richer, but to weave themselves into every corner of Florentine life. Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's son, took the family from wealthy merchants to the unofficial rulers of Florence. He wasn't called Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland, for nothing. Cosimo didn't flaunt power with crowns or thrones. He pulled strings quietly, funding allies, managing elections, and using his fortune to make sure Florence danced to his tune. But he also did something that would give the family a legacy beyond politics. He poured money into art and learning. Walk through Florence today, and you're walking through the Medici's vision. Cosimo financed the reconstruction of San Lorenzo, hired the brilliant architect Brunelleschi, and supported scholars who were reviving the works of Plato and Aristotle. Remember how we spoke of the Renaissance dawning in Florence, with its burst of art, wealth, and humanism? The Medici were the fuel that kept that fire burning. Then came Lorenzo de' Medici, known to history as Lorenzo the Magnificent. If Cosimo built the stage, Lorenzo filled it with stars. He turned Florence into a cultural empire where artists, poets, and philosophers found both patronage and protection. Lorenzo supported Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus still captures the imagination. He gave young Michelangelo a place in his household, nurturing a genius who would later carve the David and paint the Sistine Chapel. Without Lorenzo, the Renaissance might have looked very different. But Lorenzo wasn't just about art. He was also a skilled politician, navigating Florence through dangerous waters. Rival families like the Pazzi tried to strike him down literally in the infamous Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, when assassins attacked him in the cathedral during Mass. Lorenzo survived. His brother Giuliano did not, and the city erupted in vengeance. That survival only added to Lorenzo's mystique, cementing him as the soul of Florence. Of course, with great wealth and power came resentment. The Medici weren't universally loved. Some Florentines saw them as tyrants hiding behind the mask of republic. After Lorenzo's death, the family was even driven out for a time, as fiery preacher Savonarola took control, railing against luxury and corruption. But the Medici always returned. Their influence was too deeply woven into the city's fabric to vanish for long. Over generations, they extended their reach beyond Florence. One branch produced popes Leo X and Clement VII, who carried Medici influence to Rome itself. Another branch produced queens, like Catherine de' Medici, who became Queen of France and shaped European politics. What began as a banking family had become a dynasty that touched every corner of power: church, court, and canvas. The Medici's cultural empire wasn't built on armies or conquests, but on patronage and vision. They understood that ideas, art, and architecture could be more enduring than fortresses. And in doing so, they left us a Florence where every street seems to whisper their name. Think of it this way. When you stand before Botticelli's Venus, gaze up at Brunelleschi's Dome, or trace the lines of Michelangelo's David, you're not just seeing masterpieces. You're seeing the fingerprints of the Medici, a family who turned wealth into beauty, ambition into culture, and Florence into the beating heart of the Renaissance. Their story shows that power isn't always about swords or crowns. Sometimes it's about knowing that the greatest empire you can build is one that lives on in stone, paint, and memory. And that was the empire of the Medici. The fall of Constantinople and Italy's shifting trade fortunes. Imagine the scene. It's May of the year 1453, and the city once called the Queen of Cities is under siege. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, has stood for over 1,000 years as the bridge between Europe and Asia. Its towering walls had withstood countless assaults, but this time the attackers were different. Ottoman cannons roared, shaking the earth, and within weeks the unthinkable happened. The city fell. The crescent replaced the cross above Hagia Sophia, and the gateway of the East was no longer in Christian hands. For most of Europe, it was a distant catastrophe. But for Italy, the shockwaves were immediate and devastating. Why? Because Italian merchants had built their fortunes on the lifeline of trade that ran through Constantinople. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had long made their wealth ferrying silks, spices, and exotic goods from Asia into European markets. Constantinople was their hub, their middleman, their guarantee of access. With the Ottomans now in control, everything changed. Venice, which had enjoyed special privileges in Byzantine ports, suddenly found itself negotiating with the Ottomans. Trade didn't stop. Venetians were far too cunning for that, but it became far more expensive and far more dangerous. Genoa, too, faced ruin. Its prized colonies in the Black Sea, like Kaffa, fell into Ottoman hands. The dream of easy profit through the old routes crumbled almost overnight. Imagine being a Genoese trader who had grown rich off the spice trade, only to wake up and realize your ships had no safe harbors to dock in anymore. This moment marked a turning point. Italian city-states had grown accustomed to wealth, flowing steadily from east to west, but the fall of Constantinople forced them to adapt or perish. Venice tried to maintain its grip, striking uneasy deals with the Ottomans, even as it fought wars to defend its interests in the Aegean. Genoa, weakened, began its slow decline, eventually falling into the shadow of stronger powers. And other cities like Florence and Milan turned their gaze more inward, focusing on banking, manufacturing, and politics rather than overseas ventures. But here's the twist. The shock of losing Constantinople didn't just hurt Italy, it reshaped the entire world. The sudden blockade of old trade routes lit a fire under European curiosity. What if there was another way to reach the riches of the East? That question would eventually send explorers westward, across the Atlantic, in search of India and China. In a strange way, the cannons that brought down Constantinople also helped launch the Age of Discovery. Still, in the 15th century, Italy wasn't thinking about the New World yet. It was reeling. Venice, ever resourceful, doubled down on its dominance of Mediterranean trade, clinging to the routes it could still control. It fought bitterly with the Ottomans in a series of wars that drained its treasury but kept it relevant. Milan, secure on land, grew stronger in politics and war, but remained wary of losing access to essential goods. Florence, meanwhile, poured its energy into banking and culture, turning financial innovation and Renaissance art into its new lifelines. Remember how we talked about the Medici family? Their rise as bankers became even more crucial as trade routes shifted away from Italian hands. For ordinary Italians, the impact was felt in prices and availability. Spices that once flowed freely now cost a fortune, luxuries became rarer, and the wealthy elite flaunted them even more as symbols of power. Imagine walking through a Florentine market and seeing pepper once common sold at prices only the richest could afford. The scarcity made these goods more desirable, but also pushed merchants and princes alike to dream of alternatives. The fall of Constantinople also shifted cultural tides. As Byzantine scholars fled westward, carrying with them ancient manuscripts and knowledge, they poured into Italian cities. Florence, in particular, became a refuge for these exiles, and their presence helped spark a deeper flowering of Renaissance thought. In a way, while Italian merchants lost fortunes, Italian artists and scholars gained treasures of the mind. So, the story of 1453 is not just about walls crumbling or empires falling. For Italy, it was about change, painful, costly, but also transformative. Venice fought to stay afloat, Genoa slipped into decline, Florence turned toward banking and brilliance, and Milan played the long game of power politics. And beyond Italy, the world itself began to shift toward oceans, exploration, and a new age of global trade. When Constantinople fell, it marked the end of an era. For Italy, it was both a wound and a spark. A wound that cut deep into the wealth of its maritime republics, and a spark that pushed Europe to look beyond the Mediterranean, forever changing the course of history. From fragmented city-states to the ambitions of unification, for centuries, Italy was like a glittering mosaic, each tile beautiful, distinct, and fiercely independent, but never quite forming a single picture. Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, the Papal States, each city or region had its own pride, its own armies, and its own ambitions. To be Italian in the Middle Ages meant very little, compared to being Florentine, Venetian, or Neapolitan. And yet, beneath the surface, a slow current of longing for unity began to stir. It would take centuries of rivalry, bloodshed, and foreign domination before the dream of unification even seemed possible. The roots of this fragmentation go all the way back to Rome's collapse. Remember how the Lombards, the Franks, and later the popes carved the peninsula into separate spheres. That set the stage for a divided Italy. Over time, cities like Venice and Florence grew rich from trade and banking. Milan flexed its military strength under dynasties like the Visconti and Sforza, and the south fell under Norman and later Spanish influence. Each power had its own allies and enemies, often looking outward toward France, the Holy Roman Empire, or Spain for support against Italian rivals. Unity was never the priority. Survival was, and yet the Renaissance gave Italians a sense of shared brilliance. The art of Florence, the scholarship of Padua, the seafaring might of Venice, all these achievements sparked a subtle recognition that this small peninsula was producing wonders unlike anywhere else. Still, that cultural unity never translated into political reality. In fact, the very wealth and brilliance of Italian cities made them targets for foreign powers. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Italian wars turned the peninsula into a battleground where France and Spain fought for dominance, with local rulers often playing the role of pawns. This foreign domination planted the seeds of something new: resentment. Ordinary Italians began to ask why their proud cities were constantly being dictated to by kings and emperors from afar. The Papal States still held sway in the centre, often acting as both a unifier and a divider. Venice clung fiercely to independence. Florence, after the Medici rose and fell, shifted between republican pride and oligarchic rule. But through it all, a question whispered louder and louder: what if Italy could be whole again? The idea of unification was not fully formed in the medieval mind, but the pieces were there. Think of the way Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 14th century, lamented Italy's divisions in his Divine Comedy. He saw the peninsula as a ship without a helmsman, tossed on the waves of foreign meddling and internal strife. Later, thinkers, poets, and even mercenary leaders echoed that frustration. Each city-state had its glories, but none could protect the entire peninsula from becoming Europe's chessboard. It's important to remember that unity was not an obvious solution. To a Venetian merchant, why sacrifice independence and wealth for the sake of Florentine bankers? To the Pope, why surrender temporal power to a national kingdom? To a Milanese duke, why give up ambitions of ruling Italy alone? These rivalries made unification seem like a distant dream, and yet the very intensity of the divisions kept the idea alive. If the fighting ever ended, perhaps Italy could stand as one. The story of Italy's eventual unification belongs to a later age, with figures like Garibaldi and Cavour in the 19th century. But the ambitions of unification began much earlier, in the medieval centuries of rivalry and resistance. Each war between Guelphs and Ghibellines, each invasion by French or Spanish troops, each papal decree defending independence, all of it fed the simmering desire to finally break the cycle. By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern world, Italy's divisions had become both its strength and its curse. Strength, because its city-states had produced a cultural explosion unmatched in history. Curse, because those very divisions left it vulnerable to outsiders who saw Italy not as a nation, but as a prize. The dream of unification lingered like a shadow, never quite visible but always there. It was born in the frustrations of poets, nurtured in the bitterness of foreign occupation, and carried in the pride Italians felt for their shared culture. From fragmented city-states rose the first sparks of an ambition that centuries later would ignite into a movement. And when it finally did, the world would see not just Florence, or Venice, or Naples, but Italy itself at last united after so many centuries apart.